Basic router configuration. Experiment objective. 1. Master several commonly used configuration methods for routers. 2. Learn how to configure routers using a console cable. 3. Learn how to configure routers using Telnet. 4. Familiarize yourself with different command modes of the router and how to switch between them. 5. Master the basic configuration commands for routers. The experimental background is as follows. You are a new network administrator at a certain company, and the company requires you to be familiar with their network products. First, you are asked to log into the router and understand the basic command line operations for routers. As a network administrator, you have recently performed the initial configuration of the router in the equipment room. Now, you wish to have the capability to remotely manage the devices from your office or while on a business trip. Therefore, you need to make appropriate configurations on the router to enable remote management. The technical principles of router configuration are as follows. Firstly, the management methods for routers are generally divided into two types. Similar to switches, in-band management, and out-of-band management. The router's console port is used for out-of-band management, which does not occupy a network interface of the router. Its characteristic is that it requires the use of a configuration cable for configuring the router in close proximity. During the initial configuration, you must use the console port for configuration. Experiment steps. 1. Create a new packet tracer topology diagram. 2. Use a standard console cable to connect the computer's serial port to the router's console port. Enable the hyperterminal on the computer and configure its parameters to establish a connection between the computer and the router via the console port. 3. Configure the management IP address for the router and set up usernames and login passwords for Telnet users. Configure the IP address on the computer. This IP address should be in the same network segment as the router's management IP address. Connect the computer and the router using an Ethernet cable. Use Telnet from the computer to log into the router and inspect the switches. Next, you will learn how to change the router's hostname. Erase configuration information. Save configuration information. Display configuration information. Configure subinterfaces. Enable router physical interfaces. Display current configuration. And view historical commands. Now, let's take a look at the equipment used in the experiment. In the packet tracer software, select one router _ 2811 router and one PC. To connect the router and PC, we will use a crossover cable and a console cable for configuration. The experimental topology diagram is as follows. The PC is connected to the router with two cables. One is the console cable, shown as the blue line in the diagram, used to log into the router for configuration. The other is a dashed line, representing the crossover cable used for the PC to access the router through Telnet for configuration. All right. Now let's see how to perform the experiment using the packet tracer software. First, we will look at the basic router configuration. To begin, select one router and one PC from the device list. Connect the PC and the router using two types of cables. One is the console cable, which connects from the router's console port to the PC's RS-232 port. This allows us to access the router for configuration. Next, use a crossover cable to connect the router's fast Ethernet 0/0 interface to the PC. With these connections, we have set up the topology shown in the experiment. Now, let's proceed with configuring the PC's IP address. Click on the desktop of the PC and configure the IP address as 192.168.1.2 with a subnet mask of 24 bits and the default gateway as 192.168.1.1. This sets up the PC's IP address. Next, we will configure the router to allow remote login from the PC. First, access the router from the command prompt and name it as R1. Set the enable secret password as 123,456 to configure the privilege mode password. Exit and enter the configuration for remote login password using line VT04 and set the login password as 654,321. Next, configure the interface IP address using NTF0/0 and no shutdown to enable the interface. Set the IP address as 192.168.1.1, which will be the default gateway for the PC. Now, let's test the communication between the PC and the router by pinging 192.168.1.2, which should be successful. Next, test if the PC can remotely log in to the router. Open the PC's command prompt and enter the router's IP address using telnet 192.168.1.1. Enter the remote login password as 654,321 and press enter. The command prompt should now change to R1, indicating that we are logged in to the R1 router. To access privilege mode, type enable and enter the privilege mode password we set earlier as 123,456. Now, we can use commands like show run to check the interface IP address 192.168.1.1 and the remote login address 654,321 on the router. By remotely logging in from the PC, we can successfully view and manage the router's configurations. This completes the basic router configuration. Students can try this experiment after the class.